Hello everybody, welcome to today's video, 7 tips for narrative writing. This question in the AQA English language exams, paper 1, question 5, can be either narrative or descriptive, and you might have 2 narrative questions, 2 descriptive questions, or 1 of each, and you choose one of those questions to answer. Now, this question alone is worth half of the marks in the entire paper, and I think because of that we should focus a bit more in the run-up to the next exam on how to improve your answers for paper 1 question 5. So today we're going to look at narrative writing, 7 top tips. Now, I've just finished reading a really fun book, How Not to Write a Novel, 200 Mistakes to Avoid at All Costs if you ever want to get published. Now, I bought that book literally to help out with this video. So I'm not trying to write a novel, but of course the same things apply when we're writing, the beginning of a story or a short story in our exams. We're going to use some of the same skills. So I've taken 7 tips from that book, and I want to talk to you about them in this video, and I've got some examples, some really good books that I've read of how to do things well, and I'm going to tell you 7 things to avoid. So the first one is to start at a pivotal moment in your narrative. Most stories start with a kind of description of character and setting, and then something happens. Most exam stories, I should say. But you have to remember that the examiner will be marking hundreds of papers and you want your work to stand out. So one of the ways to do that is to actually introduce your character when he or she is already in the midst of a gripping conflict, and then use most of the remaining story to bring the reader full circle back to where it started. And immediately you're going to get marks for inventive use of structural features when you do that. So once the story has some momentum, you can pause the action to bring the reader up to date with any background information that's necessary. Now, what I will say is your story doesn't have to be action-packed in the sense of explosions and stabbings and guns and death and all of that sort of thing. I think that's something that I see in a lot of exam work. It's something about this kind of, if I want any sort of sense of energy or tension, it needs to be, really kind of like an Arnold Schwarzenegger action movie. And that isn't true. You can actually describe very small details and very small events with lots and lots of energy. But I'm going to show you an example, which is the opening few lines from a book called The Thousand Autumns of Jacob de Zoet. And this is an amazing book by David Mitchell. So this is how the book starts, and this would be an example of starting in the middle of some action. So let's have a look. Miss Kawasimi, Orito kneels on a stale and sticky futon. Can you hear me? In the rice paddy beyond the garden, a cacophony of frogs detonates. Orito dabs the concubine's sweat-drenched face with a damp cloth. She's barely spoken, the maid holds the lamp, for hours and hours. Miss Kawasimi, my name's Ebegwa. I'm a midwife. I want to help. Kawasimi's eyes flicker open. She manages a frail sigh. Her eyes shut. She's too exhausted, Orito thinks, even to fear dying tonight. So this is the beginning of the book, and it starts at this moment of great tension, and obviously we don't know at this point, because this is literally the opening, we don't know who Miss Kawasimi is or who Orito is. We don't even really know where we are. The second paragraph, the little bit about the rice paddy, perhaps gives us a sense of where we might be. But then it moves on to another character, and then we have the little bit about I'm a midwife, and we think, okay, right, this is a baby being born. But of course, once this moment takes place, it'll then go back in time and introduce, perhaps at the beginning of the day, the character at a more calm moment. But jumping right into a moment of conflict is a fantastic way of writing. And if you read a lot of fiction, it's the sort of thing that a lot of professional writers do. The next thing is to do with description of character. So if you're writing a narrative, you want to have some characters, and you want to be able to describe the characters because the reader needs to be able to picture in their mind, what is going on and who's involved, and just kind of have that picture in their head of the whole thing that you're writing about. But a lot of descriptions of characters read like a police report. So there's something like this. Joe was a medium-sized man with brown hair and brown eyes. Alan wore a white shirt and blue jeans on his tall frame. And the thing is, if you're going to tell the reader something about a character, you've got to tell them something that is interesting. You don't want to just tell details that, like hair color or eye color or that kind of thing. You want to concentrate on features and qualities that are specific to your character. And there are lots of ways of describing character. I might actually make a separate video on this, but one good example comes from Toni Morrison's book, Jazz, which again is an amazing book. And here we have a description of the character Violet. And, again, let's have a look at this example and talk about it. I know that woman. She used to live with a flock of birds on Lenox Avenue. Know her husband, too. He fell for an 18-year-old girl with one of those deep-down spooky loves that made him so sad and happy he shot her just to keep the feeling going. When the woman, her name is Violet, went to the funeral to see the girl and to cut her dead face, they threw her to the floor and out of the church. She ran then through all that snow, and when she got back to her apartment she took the birds from the cages and set them out the windows to freeze or fly, including the parrot that said, "I love you." Now this is just an amazing piece of writing. Morrison doesn't write, Violet was driven crazy by grief, even to the point of disfiguring a dead girl when her lover cheated on her. Instead, she shows Violet acting out her grief on the very first page, and through the actions we learn things about the character. This is very similar to Show Me, Don't Tell Me, which I've got a little point on later, but don't just tell the reader something about the character, or don't just narrate a kind of synopsis of the plot, but describe action taking place that teaches us something about the character. And that's just one of the ways of describing character, but at the very least, avoid this kind of police report, physical description, like a list of their physical attributes. The next point is to avoid cliches, the constant use of off-the-shelf phrases which can just sap the life from your writing. Because they're so familiar, these phrases are drained of even the meaning of the individual words that make them up. So let's look at an example. She gave him a deep, melting kiss before falling into his strong arms, swept away by her feelings. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. The square-jawed He-Man crushed her in a powerful embrace. Her knees were weak. He was all she'd ever dreamed of. And this is just sort of too many cliches after cliche after cliche, these well-known phrases and sayings. You want to be creative. This is a creative writing question. You want to use your own phrases and not these sort of off-the-shelf phrases that we're all very familiar with. One very, very relevant to young people, avoid hysterical punctuation. The exclamation mark is probably the most commonly abused form of punctuation. Something like this. She saw him across the room. Jack, it's me. I'm so glad to see you. All these exclamation marks, the capitalization of complete words, which of course is grammatically accurate. You can capitalize a whole word to emphasize it. But this kind of over-the-top dramatic dialogue is really not necessary. Show Me, Don't Tell Me is all about, don't just tell me in a kind of synopsis, a narration, what is happening. Okay, so don't write something like Mike hit him with a metal bar and the man fell dead. Mike left hurriedly, realizing he was going to go to jail. Getting in his car, he drove away fast, heading for a hotel. At the hotel, he sat and decided what to do. This kind of just telling me, sentence by sentence, telling me what was happening. For a story to work, it needs enough detail to bring the story to life in the reader's mind. And in real life, okay, the physical world effortlessly exists and it's visible without anyone's help. But in fiction, in your story writing, in your narrative pieces, unless you describe it, it's not there. Now, Show Me, Don't Tell Me is this great idea of write something about a character, but don't just tell me what's happening. So here's a good example. This is a different scenario because you know what was happening in the first scenario. Her eyes searched quickly, flitting around the room. It had to be here somewhere. Her hands were starting to shake, the familiar signal from her bloodstream that time was running out. Beads of sweat rolled down her forehead as she overturned dirty pillows and tore open empty cupboards. She reached for her purse, but she knew already what she would find inside. Nothing. She screamed a desperate scream. Now, what's going on in this narrative? I'm showing you what's taking place rather than telling you. And as a result, you as a reader are invested in it because you're trying to work out what's going on. You're reading the clues. So you might think, is this person looking for money? Well, what does the familiar signal from the bloodstream mean? Are they looking for medication? Could that be drugs? Or could it just be, needing, for example, an insulin injection. Well, let's have a look at the evidence. What about dirty pillows, empty cupboards? That seems a bit kind of sinister. Maybe this is a drug situation. So much better than just telling you. She was a drug addict looking for drugs. She looked in her house, but she could not find them. Describe the moment, and it's so much better in your writing. Don't assume the reader knows what you mean. So I'll give you a bad example of this. Joe felt so different now. It was a completely overwhelming feeling that he couldn't pin down. He sat down on the cliff edge and scanned the vista below. It was perfect. Everything was perfect. The mountains below were like nothing he'd ever seen before, and the air was just the right temperature. It's something to be said about not using words like perfect in your writing. Not saying, like nothing you've ever seen before, completely overwhelming. You need to describe it so that the reader can actually picture it as well. Because if you're just explaining something through how a character reacts to it, then the reader cannot picture in their mind what the character is reacting to. So this may well be the character's reaction to the situation they find themselves in. That's absolutely fine, and you can have a character reacting to any sort of event that you want, but you have to make sure that you actually describe what's going on so that we as the reader understand what you mean as well, and avoiding words, like avoiding things like impossible to describe or something like that. It's just too too kind of simplistic. You're not going to be able to picture in your mind what it is the reader's thinking. It is fine to show the world of your story through the reactions of your characters, but we still want to see the world, not just the reactions. The reactions themselves must be vividly described if they're to mean anything to the reader. So words like amazing and terrific, awful, horrible, they're not descriptions. Saying that something defies description is no good in your narrative piece. Don't include every single word of dialogue. Now, I would say that dialogue is the hardest thing to write in a narrative piece. Okay, so you're going to want some dialogue, although I would argue that it's probably a good idea to have a minimal amount of dialogue anyway. But what you have to think about is not including every single word. So have a look at this on the screen. "Hi, Harriet," said Jane, sitting down at the restaurant table. "Sorry I'm late." "Hi, Jane, nice to see you," said Harriet. "Have you been waiting long?" Jane said anxiously. "No, don't worry, only 5 minutes." "Oh, that's not bad," Jane smiled, relieved. "No, I was late too. The buses were a nightmare." "Yes, the trains were no good either." The two laughed. Then Jane picked up her menu. "Have you decided?" The shrimp boulevard looks good." Jane frowned in concentration. "Or the lasagna. I wonder if that is vegetarian. I guess I can ask." "Jane, I'm beginning to worry that the compounds present in the creature's brains may cause their strange behaviour. Using them as a protein source could have deadly consequences." Just then the waitress appeared to take their order. "Hi, would you like to hear the specials?" she said happily. Now you can see through this example, and this is an over-the-top example, but I don't think it's a million miles away from what we can find ourselves falling into. But you can see that actually the kind of small chit-chat of the restaurant and being late and why you're late and all that kind of thing doesn't help. And it's not until we get to right near the end where we actually have some dialogue that's linked to the kind of key thing of the plot here. So you might want to get a sense of realism, but reality has to be put aside in the interests of realism to avoid boring our readers here. And kind of one of the things in the mark scheme is about being convincing and compelling means you want to read on, and you're not going to want to read on if it's like this. So you might have to replace all of that with something like this. "Arriving at the restaurant 5 minutes late, Jane made her excuses as she took her seat at the table. Harriet was looking worried. About the result of the autopsy," she began. So you're writing, you've cut out the unnecessary dialogue. Well, I hope you found this video useful. Please do subscribe to the channel. There is more help and sample answers and good ideas and tips, tricks and advice on narrative writing and descriptive writing in my guide to GCSE English language. It's available in paperback on Amazon for £6.99.